What I am going to give you guys is going to be a little bit more of a negative list, kind of like the NBA redraft of 2013 after a little bit. But this is going to be my top 5 busts all time. My top 5 NBA draft busts of all time. That's what I'm going to give you guys right now. I hope you guys are excited because I know I am. We are going to start out with a doozy. Number 5 is going to be Kwame Brown. Now, Kwame Brown is, a lot of people may put him at number 1. Honestly, a lot of people may put all of these guys at number 1. And before I continue, I do actually kind of want to go over some ground rules here, just so there's no controversy, just so people are like, well, what about this person? What about this person? Oh, I'm sure I'm going to get that anyway. But here are kind of a couple of ground rules that I want to talk about. Number 1. The amount of years you ended up playing does factor in, for the most part, to my decision as to whether to rank you higher or whether to rank you lower or whether to not rank you on this list at all. So if you played for a longer period of time, unless you were just god-awful, chances are you're going to be fine in terms of, you're not going to be rated lower than a guy who played for 2 or 3 years, if that makes sense. Also, this is going to probably be the most controversial statement that I make. Okay? So I'm going to lean back in my chair because I know that I'm just going to get a heat wave of judgment here. I don't believe that people who were chronically injured truly are busts. That's right. I don't. Now, the reason is because if they were healthy, they may have been either successful enough to have warranted the draft pick, or at the very least, not nearly as bad as people will think. For instance, let me ask you a question, just rhetorical. Is Andrew Wiggins worth the number 1 pick in the draft like he was? Some people will say, he's underperformed for a number 1 pick. Fine, but is he a bad player? No. He's not a bad player. In fact, he's one of the key reasons the Warriors won the championship last year. He's certainly found a fantastic role for himself. And he's a really, really, really good player. Definitely well above average. Is he generationally good? No. So, if somebody was drafted really high up and got hurt, then it's possible that if they had stayed healthy, they may have had an Andrew Wiggins type career at the very least, where, they may have not been statistically as fantastic as some other number 1 picks in the past, or some other very high draft picks in the past, but they may have not been a horrible player or a complete bust if they were healthy. So for me, players like Greg Oden, specifically, is the guy that's going to probably stand out in everybody's mind as guys that were draft busts that were injured all the time. Guys like Greg Oden are not going to be on this list. I'm just letting you know in advance. Now, Greg Oden, yes, obviously one of the biggest draft busts of all time, but for me, he's not necessarily a bust because if you go back and look at his statistics and watch him play, when he played, he was really good. He was averaging a double-double. That's pretty freaking good for a big man. And the problem is that he just couldn't stay on the court. And so it completely derailed his career. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys. Whether you guys agree with that, disagree with that, feel free to let me know. But for the purposes of this video, it's too late. So we're going to go with what I have. So Greg Oden, guys like that, not on the list. So just wanted to throw that out there. And also, draft positioning does matter. So for me, if you were drafted number 1 or number 2 and you stunk, then you're probably going to be higher on this list than if you were drafted at number 7 overall and you stunk. Once you get past the first 3 picks in the draft, who knows? Because it just depends on the draft class. You might have 2 or 3 really generationally good players, and then everybody else stinks in the draft. So, if you only had 2 good players and you drafted at 5, chances were, even if one of those guys was available at the time, statistically speaking, you probably weren't going to get one of those 2 good players anyway. So I'm not going to blame a team for getting a bad 7th pick or having a bad 9th pick or whatever. At least not as high as, I would if somebody had the number 1 pick or number 2 pick, so on and so forth. So hopefully that makes sense. And with that, let's get back to it. So number 5, wrong way. Number 5, Kwame Brown. Kwame Brown had a 12-year career, so he ended up actually sticking around for a while, which is really, really nice. He was drafted number 1 overall in 2001 by the Washington Wizards. He only had, in 12 seasons, he only had 1 year where he averaged 10 or more points. And I think one of the most famous things about Kwame Brown was that Michael Jordan just tore him to shreds when he was running the Wizards at the time. So, it's really sad because Kwame Brown, I think, may have ended up turning into something serviceable if given another chance, and if he could go back in time and change some things. But Kwame Brown, just not a good player, and so he is number 5 on my list of biggest draft busts of all time. Number 4, Michael Olowokandi. Who? Exactly. So Michael Olowokandi, he was drafted number 1 overall in 1998 by the Los Angeles Clippers, one of their many, 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 many draft busts over the years. He was actually, he had a fantastic nickname, the Candyman, obviously Olowokandi, and so his nickname was the Candyman, obviously spelled with a K, as you can see up there. He played for 9 total seasons. And really only 2 of them were serviceable, where he was averaging, 8 points, 8 rebounds, something along those lines. But when you're drafted number 1 overall, 8 points a night ain't going to do it. So he never shot over 45% from the field. Now, we see it a lot today where guys, they're not, even if they're really good, they may only shoot a little bit above 45%. Or, even below 45%. And that's not super weird now, but that's also because people are shooting a lot more three-pointers. Michael Olowokandi was a center. He did not shoot threes. So the fact that he was a center and he couldn't, finish baskets when he's 2 feet away or 3 feet away or right under the basket for more than 45%, and that was 1 year, by the way. Every other year was below that. That's really, really sad when you have that situation. So Olowokandi, just not very good, and he was actually drafted ahead of so many guys that were really good. Just name a few: Vince Carter, Paul Pierce, Dirk Nowitzki. And when you have a draft where those 3 guys are drafted and none of them went number 1 overall, you sit there and think, oh my gosh, who was the generational prospect that went number 1 in that draft with Pierce and Carter and Dirk Nowitzki, 3 Hall of Fame worthy players? The Candyman. So that's who went. And by the way, going back to Kwame Brown for a second here, he was actually drafted ahead of Pau Gasol and Joe Johnson and Tyson Chandler, who was a very good defender for a few years, so why not throw him in there, I guess. But definitely at least Joe Johnson and Pau Gasol, no good. So anyways, Michael Olowokandi is number 4. Number 3 is Hasheem Thabeet. He was drafted number 2 overall, so the first non-number 1 overall pick on my list. Number 2 overall in 2009 by the Memphis Grizzlies. He stunk. I don't really know what else to say. He stunk. I don't know any other way to put it. All these guys stunk in some way, shape, or form. But hey, listen, Kwame Brown played 12 years. And one of those seasons, he averaged 10 plus points a night. So you could at the very least say, hey, for a year, he was above average, right? Michael Olowokandi, yeah, he played for 9 seasons. He never really performed pretty well. But like I said, he had a couple of serviceable years where he was averaging 8.5, 9.5 points a night, 9 rebounds a night. He was a good shot blocker for a little bit. So you know what? You could at least get some use out of him. Hasheem Thabeet played for 5 years. 5 years as a number 2 overall pick. And he was completely out of the NBA. Couldn't find a job. 5 years. He ended his career averaging 2 points and 2 rebounds a night. Yuck. I mean, yuck. That is horrible. It was very, very tempting to put him at number 1 on this list. And if it wasn't for the 2 guys ahead of him being so catastrophically bad, he would have been number 1 in a lot of circles. And you know what? A lot of people may say that he is number 1. I get it. Trust me, I get it. Hasheem Thabeet was horrible. But he's still only number 3 on this list. Number 2, a guy that I have already talked about on this channel if you watched my 2013 NBA redraft, Anthony Bennett. I know. I may have even said in that video, I'll have to go back and watch it, that he is the number 1 draft bust of all time. May have even said that. Turns out, I was wrong. I proved myself wrong. And I had another guy in mind when I think of worst draft busts, which obviously you'll see at number 1. And so, you know, it was kind of a toss-up between Anthony Bennett and this other guy who, again, I will reveal here in a little bit. But Anthony Bennett, I'm not going to go super deep into why he stunk. Only played for 4 years. Was really, really terrible. And now he's out of the NBA completely. The only reason for me that he is not number 1 is because the draft class that he was in was horrible. And we've talked about it on the channel, obviously. If you haven't seen my video on the 2013 redraft, please go watch that. I worked really, really hard on that, and I'm very proud of it. So, the only reason that he's not number 1 is because the draft class was awful. The only 2 guys that, quite frankly, I'm disgusted that he was drafted over are Giannis, for obvious reasons, and Rudy Gobert for obvious reasons, right? And there's a bunch of other guys that have been serviceable, like, you know, your Dennis Schroeders, Tim Hardaway. So, you know, there's some guys that are pretty good in that draft class. But, you know, nobody that I'm like, oh, he got drafted over Mason Plumlee. What a joke. Like, no, I don't care. So, but those 2 guys, yeah, obviously. But that draft class was horrible. So, you know what? If you're going to miss, you might as well miss in the worst draft class of all time. I get it. It's, you know, that class was difficult to hit really anybody on. So, yeah. He's number 2. So, who the heck is number 1? Well, before I get to that, I want to talk about a few honorable mentions here. So some honorable mentions, guys that were very, very close to making it in my top 5, but just did not make it for whatever reason. And I'm going to explain that a little bit. Adam Morrison, he was drafted number 3 overall in his draft. Adam Morrison, he's very accomplished. Honestly, he's got 2 NBA championships with the Lakers. And the reason why he is not in the top 5 is because, for me, Adam Morrison, he won 2 championships, even though all he did was ride the bench. And what people don't talk about enough about Adam Morrison is, yes, he struggled his rookie year with efficiency. He really, really struggled. He was only shooting like 38% from the field his rookie year. But he was still averaging 12 points a night. He was still playing a ton of minutes. And he had started only 30 games. So at that point, when you have an inefficient rookie, right? And Adam Morrison was also struggling with adapting to the athleticism and the quickness and the speed of the NBA as well. But you know what? He still had plenty of time to kind of figure all that stuff out. He could have improved. He definitely could have improved. But he then had a catastrophic knee injury that kept him out for his entire second year. And from then on, he just was not the same. Now, am I saying that without that knee injury, Adam Morrison would have turned into, you know, Steph Curry or something? No, of course I'm not. But as I said earlier, we don't know what he could have turned into. He was still very young. And he wasn't playing atrociously bad his rookie year. Yeah, he wasn't playing great, but a lot of rookies don't play great their first year in the NBA. So, for me, it's hard for me to justify putting Adam Morrison in the top 5 because we don't know what his career would have been had he not had to take that entire season off because of injury, and then he really just wasn't the same after that. Sam Bowie. He was drafted number 2 overall. He is probably number 6 on this list if I really had to pick one. Number 6 on this list because of who was drafted right behind Sam Bowie Michael Jordan. When you miss on Mike, you're going to be one of the biggest draft busts of all time. And unfortunately for Sam Bowie, he is the guy that really is considered, one of the most famous draft busts ever. Because it went Hakeem Olajuwon at number 1, and then Sam Bowie at number 2, and then Michael Jordan at number 3, sandwiched with two of the best players to ever walk the earth. And, I feel bad for Sam Bowie. But again, Sam Bowie was one of those players that struggled a lot with injury. Now, again, I'm not saying that he would have been very good. He probably wouldn't have been better than Hakeem or Michael Jordan, I can promise you that. But, again, as I've said before, guys who are injured a ton, and that could conceivably be the reason why they struggled a lot, chances are they're not going to make this list, and that's the reason why Sam Bowie is not in my top 5. Jimmer Fredette, he was drafted at number 10 overall in his draft. Coined to be the next Steph Curry. And he was not. He was the first Jimmer Fredette. And the only Jimmer Fredette. Which honestly is an accomplishment in and of itself. He was horrible. He didn't adapt to the NBA well. The game was way too fast for him, and he was out of the league in just a couple of seasons. Tried to make a comeback, I think back in 2017 or 2018 with the Suns. Didn't work out. He's putting up 970 points a night in China somewhere, or something like that. So, it's not that he's a bad player. It's just, the NBA just wasn't for him. The reason why he is not in my top 5 is that he was drafted at number 10 overall. And by the way, fun fact about Jimmer Fredette, when he was actually drafted by the Milwaukee Bucks and traded to the Sacramento Kings on draft night, and a whole bunch of players in this trade that are still around today actively or have just retired. Sean Livingston, Tobias Harris, Bismack Biyombo, Steven Jackson, all these guys that have made big names for themselves. And Jimmer Fredette, his first taste of the NBA was kind of being tossed around in these trades with all these players in a 3-team deal, I think with the Hornets, the Kings, and the Bucks, if I remember correctly. But either way, the Jimmer Fredette train did not really leave the station. And the reason why he is not in my top 5 is, as I said at the beginning of the video, if you are drafted higher, that means chances are you're going to, higher than 2 or 3, chances are, I'm not going to hold it against you as much. He was drafted at number 10. It's not weird to see number 10 draft picks, fail in the NBA. We see it time and time again. But Jimmer Fredette was a special case because he was really going to be the next Steph Curry. He was going to be the guy that's, shooting the lights out every single night and putting up 40 points a night because nobody could stop him, and it just didn't happen. So he is definitely a huge draft bust. And LaRue Martin. Now, LaRue Martin, you can argue, if you kind of look at his statistics, he may be the least productive number 1 pick in history. With kind of competition with Anthony Bennett and and maybe Michael Olowokandi, but Olowokandi at least played for 9 seasons. Anthony Bennett and LaRue Martin only played for 4 seasons, and that is no good. So why is LaRue Martin not in my top 5? The reason is because if you look back at that 1972 draft, it's awful. And I don't mean 2013 awful. I mean possibly the worst draft ever. Where you really only had 2 good players. Now, those 2 good players were generationally good in Bob McAdoo and Dr. J. Julius Erving. Okay? Those are the 2 players. You look back at that draft, virtually no one else even made any kind of note in the NBA whatsoever. Everyone in that draft class was awful other than Bob McAdoo and Dr. J. So, when your chances of getting a generation or even a decent player in draft are 1 in 15, if you don't get these 2 guys, then you will have gotten somebody awful. I'm going to not hold that against LaRue Martin. So, while you might think that that's crazy, I understand. And I know I said Adam Morrison might be number 6 or Sam Bowie. I said one of those 2. LaRue Martin might be number 6. Honestly, all these guys might be number 6. They're all very, very close to making the list. The point is, I can understand if you think that LaRue Martin might want to make this list, or maybe not want to, but should make this list. But you know what? That's how I feel. I'm not going to hold it too much against him for being that bad if that draft class is as bad as it obviously was. So who is my number 1 draft bust in the NBA of all time? Can you guess it? Do you know who it is? If you got to this point in the video, drop your comment who you think the number 1 draft bust of all time is. I'll wait. Okay, number 1. Darko Milicic. Darko Milicic is my number 1 NBA draft bust of all time. I know it's probably a controversial one for a lot of people because he wasn't a number 1 pick, and he's won a championship in the NBA. And if you look at his statistics, he played 12 years. So it's not like he's like an Anthony Bennett or a LaRue Martin or a Hasheem Thabeet that only played a couple of seasons. He actually carved out a decently long NBA career. So why is he the number 1 draft bust of all time? Because as I've said earlier, right? If you play for longer, chances are you're not going to be penalized as bad as somebody like an Anthony Bennett or a Hasheem Thabeet that played for only a couple of seasons, right? That's what I said, so I'm contradicting myself. I understand, but here's why. First of all, he was awful. I mean, just like everybody else in this video, he was awful. Okay, Darko Milicic was tasked with being the next Dirk Nowitzki. Okay, he was tasked with being the next Dirk. So you think that this is a 7-foot tall European player that can shoot the lights out, right? Because that's what Dirk was. He was a unicorn at that time. He was a big, tall guy, 7 feet tall, that could shoot. Not only could Darko Milicic not shoot well, Darko Milicic in 12 years in the NBA did not make a single three-point shot. So you're talking about a guy that was compared to one of the greatest shooters to ever walk the earth coming out of the draft. And the man could not shoot. Now, maybe he could shoot, like physically, as in he could actually grab the basketball and put it in a shooting motion from that far away, but he never did it. I think he may have only attempted like 1 or 2 3-pointers in his whole career. So where's that comparison? That doesn't make any sense. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, he won a championship in the NBA with the Detroit Pistons, who drafted him, and he barely played. Imagine what would have happened if he actually had turned out, how dominant that Pistons team might have been. And the worst part of it all, I've talked about, obviously, Giannis, right? And Rudy Gobert for Anthony Bennett. I don't know if I mentioned this, but Hasheem Thabeet was drafted number 2 overall before James Harden and before Steph Curry. Ouch. 2 generationally good players right there. Obviously, Steph Curry, one of the greatest players of all time. James Harden, probably going to be a Hall of Famer someday, just purely because of his sheer offensive onslaught in his prime. So we've seen a lot of these guys kind of get drafted before really good players, right? So, number 1 overall in the draft, Darko Milicic, for those of you who do not know, was LeBron James. So, not going to really hold that against you. But when you kind of look at the whole picture, you kind of see why he's such a horrible draft list. Right before him was LeBron. And the next 3 picks in that draft: Chris Bosh, Dwayne Wade, Carmelo Anthony. So, 1 through 5 are 4 Hall of Famers and Darko Milicic, who stunk. I mean stunk. 4 Hall of Famers. If you had a top 5 draft pick in 2003, you literally had an 80% chance of drafting a Hall of Famer, and the Detroit Pistons picked Darko Milicic, the next Dirk Nowitzki that couldn't shoot. I don't think there's even much more of an argument I need to make here. And again, this whole list is subjective, right? Feel free to disagree with the order. You know, you could even disagree with the logic of, people that have a lot of injuries shouldn't be on this list, right? I understand. And all these guys on the list, well, some of them, they did battle some injuries here and there. They were pretty much just awful, all of them. Just horrible. Just stunk at basketball in the NBA. Just really bad. Darko Milicic managed to be a blotch and a stain on the legacy of the top 5 of the 2003 draft. 4 of the most impactful players of this generation were drafted at 1, 3, 4, and 5 in that draft. And sandwiched in between all of them is Darko Milicic. So, Darko Milicic is my number 1 draft bust of all time. Hey guys, me again. Thank you so much for watching one of my clips from the Lopes Goes Last podcast. These clips are so much fun to do. I absolutely love making them, and I absolutely love doing them. And this podcast is my baby, so I really want this thing to grow, and I really want it to succeed. So if you did like what you see, please subscribe. Also hit that bell notification so you never miss any one of my episodes or one of my clips like this one. And please do also like and share these videos with your friends and your family so that we can make this thing grow as fast as possible. And I wanted to thank you again so much. And I hope you guys enjoyed the video and have a great rest of your day.